At a remote highway stop in the Arizona desert, what began as aggressive intimidation transformed into one of the most remarkable displays of military expertise and forgiveness when the infamous Iron Hounds motorcycle gang thought they'd found an easy mark in Major Alexandra Winters. They never expected this composed woman in civilian clothes to be a decorated Army Special Forces veteran who would teach them an unforgettable lesson about duty and redemption that would change dozens of lives forever. The scorching afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the cracked asphalt of Desert Oasis Travel Stop, 40 miles outside of Phoenix. Major Alexandra "Alex" Winters adjusted her leather jacket, the familiar weight of her concealed sidearm, a reminder of habits formed through 15 years of Army Special Forces operations. Her sharp hazel eyes scanned the quiet rest area, taking in every detail. The elderly couple refueling their RV, the young mother trying to calm two restless children by the vending machines, Jack Morgan organizing supplies behind the store counter. The smell of hot pavement and desert sage drifted through the air, mixing with the aroma of truck stop coffee. Alex took a slow sip from her cup, letting the familiar scents ground her in the present moment. After 3 years of civilian life following her distinguished military career, she was still adjusting. The highway stop hadn't changed much since her childhood trips through the area, but she certainly had. Alex absently touched the thin scar above her right eyebrow, a souvenir from a close-quarters battle in Kandahar that had earned her the Silver Star. That day had taught her how quickly peaceful situations could explode into chaos. The lesson served her well as the first distant rumble of motorcycles echoed across the desert landscape. The elderly couple looked up from their RV, concern creasing their weathered faces. The young mother gathered her children closer, while Jack Morgan stepped out from behind his counter, anxiety evident in his stance. Alex remained still, her posture relaxed but alert, years of combat experience having taught her to read situations before they fully developed. 7 motorcycles thundered into the parking lot, their engines deliberately loud in the quiet afternoon air. The bikes formed a wide arc facing the store, a classic intimidation tactic that Alex recognized from her counterinsurgency training. The riders cut their engines in sequence, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the gentle desert wind and the hum of the air conditioning unit. The leader, a muscular man with a graying beard and arms covered in military-themed tattoos, dismounted first. His leather vest displayed the Iron Hounds patch with wolf emblazoned beneath it. The smell of whiskey carried across the hot asphalt, preceding his approach. Behind him, his crew spread out in a practiced formation that spoke of military background, though their movements were sloppy from alcohol. "Well, what do we have here?" Does Connor Wolf Harrison slurred, his bloodshot eyes fixing on Alex's stance. Someone looking mighty comfortable in Hound territory. His right-hand man, Jason Razor Foster, moved to his left, a heavy chain wrapped around his fist. The others, Kyle Phoenix Mitchell fingering a knife handle, Eric Reaper Walsh cracking his knuckles, and Brett Stryker Daniels blocking the store entrance, positioned themselves with drunken menace. Alex noticed Samuel Medic Richardson, the Vietnam-era Army medic who worked at the stop, quietly ushering the young mother and her children toward the back of the store. The elderly couple had retreated to their RV, the husband's hand hovering near his door, likely concealing his own weapon. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Alex said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded Special Forces teams in combat. "Might want to reconsider operating those bikes in your current state." She kept her tone professional, giving them a chance to back down without losing face. Harrison's expression darkened as he took an unsteady step forward. "You threatening us, lady?" Behind him, Foster let the chain slip slightly, metal links clinking against the pavement like a rattlesnake's warning. Through the store window, Alex saw Jack Morgan reaching for his phone, though she knew the nearest highway patrol was at least 15 minutes out. "No threats," Alex replied evenly. "Just a suggestion. You're drunk, there are families here, and this won't end well for anyone." She remained motionless, but her weight shifted imperceptibly, preparing for what she hoped wouldn't be necessary. Harrison laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the desert air. "Boys, I think this lady needs to learn how we handle suggestions in our territory." He gestured to his men, who began to move with exaggerated swagger, still maintaining their loose formation. Alex watched them position themselves, noting their patterns and weaknesses. Despite their intimidating appearance, their movements betrayed their military background. Army, she guessed. Probably Rangers, given their coordination, though years of alcohol and bad choices had eroded their discipline. "Last chance," Alex said quietly, shifting her weight almost imperceptibly. "Walk away now, and we all go home safely." She kept her voice low, professional, the same tone she'd used to defuse countless potentially violent situations during her career. Harrison's response was a roar of rage as he lunged forward, his massive fist swinging in a wild arc. But Alex wasn't there anymore. She had already moved, her years of training taking over as the violence she'd hoped to avoid erupted in the quiet desert afternoon. The highway stop's other occupants were about to witness something they'd never forget, a demonstration of skill and power that would change not just this moment, but the lives of everyone present. Harrison's momentum carried him forward as Alex sidestepped smoothly, her movements precise and controlled. Years of close-quarters combat training had taught her that the most effective response was often the simplest. She didn't strike back. Not yet. Instead, she let Harrison stumble past her, his drunken state making his recovery slow and unsteady. "Big mistake," Razor snarled, unwrapping the chain from his fist with practiced speed. Behind him, Phoenix drew his knife, the blade catching the harsh Arizona sun. The elderly couple retreated further into their RV, the husband now openly holding what appeared to be a service pistol. Through the store windows, Jack Morgan was already on the phone with Highway Patrol, but Alex knew help was still too far away. "You boys really don't want this fight," Alex said calmly, her eyes tracking each biker's position. Reaper and Stryker had moved to flank her, while Phoenix hung back, his knife held with the awkward grip of someone who'd learned to fight on the streets rather than in combat training. Harrison regained his balance, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. "Get her!" he roared, spittle flying from his lips. Razor's chain whipped through the air with a menacing whistle, aiming for Alex's head. Alex moved with fluid grace, catching the chain mid-swing and yanking it hard. Razor, unprepared for her strength and technique, stumbled forward. She stepped inside his guard, using his own momentum to flip him over her hip. He hit the pavement with a heavy thud, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending the chain skittering across the asphalt. Phoenix rushed in with his knife, but his attack was telegraphed and sloppy. Alex deflected his knife hand with her forearm, then delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus. As he doubled over gasping, she smoothly disarmed him, sending the knife sliding under a nearby pickup truck. Stryker attempted to grab her from behind, but Alex had already anticipated the move. She dropped her center of gravity, using his own forward momentum to send him flying over her shoulder. He landed hard beside Razor, who was still struggling to regain his breath. Reaper, seeing his companion so easily dispatched, hesitated for a moment before charging in with a wild haymaker. Alex read his telegraphed punch easily, ducking under it and sweeping his legs. He went down hard, his head bouncing off the sun-baked asphalt. Harrison watched in disbelief as his men were systematically dismantled. Something changed in his bloodshot eyes. A flash of recognition, perhaps even respect. "Wait!" he called out, but it was too late. Razor had regained his feet and charged again, this time with brass knuckles drawn from his vest pocket. Alex's expression hardened. The weapon changed things. Now she had to end this decisively before someone got seriously hurt. She met Razor's charge with ruthless efficiency. A quick step inside his swing, a sharp strike to his wrist that sent the brass knuckles flying, then an elbow to his temple that dropped him like a stone. Phoenix and Stryker rushed her simultaneously. Alex moved between them like water, letting their drunken attacks cancel each other out. Phoenix caught Stryker's wild punch square in the face, while Stryker took a knee to the ribs meant for Alex. The sound of their collision echoed across the parking lot, drawing winces from the onlookers who had gathered at a safe distance. Through the store windows, Diana Chen watched with her children, her eyes wide with amazement. Her youngest child, no more than 6, clutched his mother's leg while staring in wonder at the display of martial skill. Samuel Richardson had moved to the doorway, his Vietnam-era combat experience, letting him appreciate the technical precision of each move. His weathered face showed a mixture of concern and admiration as he recognized the telltale signs of professional military training. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jack Morgan had stopped talking on his phone, transfixed by the display of martial prowess. In his 30 years running the Desert Oasis, he'd seen his share of fights, but nothing like this. Nothing with this level of controlled expertise. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as the confrontation continued to unfold. Reaper tried to crawl toward his fallen friend's brass knuckles, his movements betraying the desperation of someone unused to being so thoroughly outmatched. Alex's boot stepped on them firmly, the rubber sole grinding against the hot asphalt. "Stay down," she advised, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd given similar warnings on far more dangerous battlefields. "You've already embarrassed yourselves enough." Harrison stood alone now, his men groaning on the pavement around him. The alcohol seemed to have burned away from his system, replaced by something else. Clarity, perhaps, or memory. The desert wind whipped up small dust devils around them, as if nature itself was marking this moment of transformation. Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse with a mixture of defeat and dawning recognition. "Major Alexandra Winters, Army Special Forces," she replied evenly, standing at parade rest more from habit than conscious choice. "And you're Sergeant First Class Harrison, 75th Ranger Regiment. Or at least you were before whatever happened to turn you into this." Harrison's eyes widened in shock, the last vestiges of his drunken bravado crumbling away. "How did you—" "Your tattoo." Alex nodded toward his forearm, where the distinct insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment was still visible beneath years of additional ink. "2nd Battalion, 75th Rangers. You served with honor once. What happened?" The question hung in the air like the desert heat, heavy with unspoken understanding between two soldiers who'd walked similar paths, only to end up on opposite sides of this moment. Harrison's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. Around them, his men began picking themselves up, nursing bruises and wounded pride, their own postures reflecting their leader's defeat. "Been a long time since anyone remembered that part of me," Harrison said quietly. The slur was gone from his voice, replaced by something that sounded almost like shame. In that moment, the facade of the hardened biker gang leader cracked, revealing glimpses of the decorated Army Ranger he'd once been. Alex kept her guard up, but softened her tone, recognizing the critical moment unfolding before her. "The Army never forgets its own, Sergeant, even when they lose their way." The desert wind picked up, sending a swirl of dust across the sun-baked parking lot. The afternoon heat pressed down on them, but neither soldier moved, locked in a moment of unspoken understanding. Harrison glanced at his fallen men, then back at Alex, his weathered face a map of regret. "I've made a right mess of things. Haven't I, Major?" His voice carried the weight of years of bad decisions, the gruff biker persona falling away to reveal the soldier beneath. His eyes, now clear from the shock of combat, carried a hint of the man he'd once been, a decorated ranger who led with honor rather than fear. Before Alex could respond, the roar of an approaching motorcycle cut through the tense silence. Kyle, Phoenix Mitchell's younger brother, Trevor, came tearing into the parking lot, his bike skidding to stop in a spray of gravel. His face was contorted with rage, a stark contrast to the growing calm that had settled over the others. The newcomer's arrival sent a fresh wave of tension through the gathered crowd. "What the hell are you doing, Wolf?" Trevor shouted, dismounting his bike. "She just humiliated all of you and you're standing there taking it?" His hands trembled with barely contained fury as he surveyed the scene, his fellow Iron Hounds picking themselves up from the pavement, their leader engaged in quiet conversation with the woman who'd just demolished their fearsome reputation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his furious features. "Stand down, Trevor," Harrison warned, but his voice lacked its usual commanding edge. The transformation happening within him had weakened his grip on authority. and Trevor sensed it like a predator smelling blood. The younger man's presence seemed to charge the air with renewed danger. "Stand down." Trevor laughed harshly, pulling out his phone. "I've got a better idea. I just called in some friends. The Night Ravens are 20 minutes out and Major Blackwood is leading them personally." His grin turned feral. "Let's see how tough the Army lady is against 30 more bikes." The threat hung in the air like the desert heat, heavy with promised violence. Alex's tactical mind immediately began assessing the new threat, drawing on years of Special Forces training. Richard Raven Blackwood's reputation preceded him. A former Army major turned outlaw biker, his Night Ravens were more paramilitary organization than motorcycle club. They were organized, well-armed, and notorious for their excessive violence. Unlike the Iron Hounds' drunken intimidation, the Ravens were known for calculated brutality. Samuel Richardson emerged from the store, his Vietnam-era combat instincts clearly on high alert. His weathered face carried the concerned expression of a man who'd seen too many battles. "Got a police scanner inside," he said quietly to Alex. "State troopers are still at least 30 minutes out. Local sheriff's department is tied up with a pileup on the interstate." The old medic's hands unconsciously checked his pockets, likely for medical supplies he'd learned to keep close during his tour in Vietnam. Harrison's face had gone pale, the last traces of alcohol completely burned away by the gravity of the situation. "Trevor, you idiot," he growled. "Blackwood's Ravens don't leave witnesses. There are children here." He gestured toward the store where Diana Chen still huddled with her kids, their faces pressed against the glass. The mother's protective embrace of her children seemed to strike something deep within Harrison's conscience. "Should have thought about that before you went soft," Trevor spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Major Blackwood's been looking for an excuse to move into this territory anyway. Now he's got one." He pulled out his phone again, checking messages with trembling fingers. "They're bringing the whole chapter, nearly 40 bikes now." Each word seemed to drive home the escalating danger of the situation. Alex watched as the situation spiraled beyond a simple confrontation. The Desert Oasis had become a potential battlefield, with civilian lives hanging in the balance. She noted the positions of everyone in play, the Chen family in the store, the elderly couple in their RV, Jack Morgan behind his counter, and Samuel Richardson moving with the measured calm of someone who'd seen combat before. Her mind was already formulating strategies, escape routes, and defensive positions. "Harrison," she said quietly, pitching her voice for his ears only. "Whatever happens next is your call, but you need to make it fast. Those Rangers' wings on your chest, they still mean something? Or did you forget everything you swore to protect?" Her words seemed to pierce through years of accumulated bitterness and regret. The former ranger looked at his scattered men, then at the civilians they'd endangered. The alcohol fog had lifted completely now, replaced by the kind of clarity that only comes in moments of crisis. He straightened his spine, muscle memory from years of military bearing taking over. In that moment, he seemed to shed the outlaw biker persona entirely, replaced by the soldier he'd once been. "Razor, Reaper, Striker," he barked, his voice finding its old strength, the command tone that had once led men into battle. "Form up. Anyone not willing to stand and protect these civilians, leave now. What's coming isn't going to be pretty." His words carried the weight of a military order, not a gang leader's threat. Trevor's triumphant grin faltered as the Iron Hounds began moving with purpose, their movements showing glimpses of their military training. Jason "Razor" Foster was the first to take position beside Harrison, checking his wounds but standing ready, his earlier aggression replaced by professional focus. Eric "Reaper" Walsh and Brett "Striker" Daniels exchanged glances, then moved to join them, their drunken swagger giving way to disciplined positioning. "You're all weak," Trevor snarled, his phone clattering to the ground. "The Ravens will tear this place apart, and you're choosing to stand with her?" His voice cracked with disbelief and rising panic as he watched his attempt at control slip away. Alex spoke up, her voice carrying across the parking lot with the authority of a combat commander. Mr. Morgan, get these civilians to the back room. Mr. Richardson, I saw a first aid kit earlier. We might need it. And someone call the state troopers again, tell them we need multiple units. She turned to Harrison. Your men still remember how to fight when they're sober? A ghost of a smile crossed Harrison's weathered face, years of hard living momentarily eclipsed by a flash of his old soldier's pride. Might remember a few things from Ranger School. Good, Alex nodded, already beginning to formulate their defensive strategy. Because we're about to give the Night Ravens a lesson they won't forget. Trevor backed away from the gathering group of reformed bikers, his earlier confidence crumbling as he watched his plan unravel. In the distance, the first rumble of approaching motorcycles grew louder, like distant thunder rolling across the desert landscape. Alex did a quick head count of their available forces. 4 former military men with the Iron Hounds, Samuel Richardson with his combat medical experience, and herself. Not ideal odds against 40 Ravens, but she'd faced worse in special forces. Harrison, give me a quick rundown on Blackwood, Alex said, already moving to assess defensive positions around the Desert Oasis. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, painting the scene in shades of amber and deep purple. Ex-Army Major, dishonorable discharge, Harrison replied, falling naturally into a military briefing stance. Runs the Ravens like a private militia. Tactical training, weapons experience, and a mean streak wider than the Grand Canyon. His men follow strict protocols, nothing like our drunken nonsense earlier. Samuel Richardson approached, his Vietnam-era instincts evident in how he moved from cover to cover. Store's got a reinforced back room, old fallout shelter from the Cold War days. Steel door, concrete walls, we can secure the civilians there. Jack Morgan emerged from the store carrying several items. Got some things that might help, he said, laying out a handful of two-way radios and a pair of night vision binoculars. Keep these for the long-haul truckers, but they're yours if you need them. Alex nodded appreciatively, quickly distributing the radios. Razor, take position behind those propane tanks, good cover and clear lines of sight. Reaper, Striker, I want you on either side of the building. Watch for flanking maneuvers. Her commands were met with crisp nods, the former soldiers responding to the familiar tone of authority. Diana Chen appeared at the store entrance, her children close behind. I was Army too, she said quietly. Signal Corps, 8 years. If you need an extra pair of hands. Alex saw the same look in her eyes that she'd seen in countless soldiers, the willingness to stand and fight when needed. Get your children secured first, Alex replied. Then if you're willing, we could use your help coordinating communications. Diana nodded sharply, ushering her kids toward the back room while Samuel Richardson began organizing the space into a makeshift command center. The sound of motorcycles grew louder. Through his binoculars, Harrison spotted the first scouts. 2 bikes running dark about 2 miles out, professional approach not like our usual bullshit. He handed the binoculars to Alex, who confirmed his assessment. The Ravens were taking a tactical approach, sending recon ahead of their main force. They'll probe our defenses before committing, Alex said, her mind racing through combat scenarios. Standard military doctrine. Blackwood may be a criminal now, but he still thinks like an officer. She turned to the gathered defenders. Remember, we're not looking for a bloodbath here. Our priority is protecting civilians until law enforcement arrives. Trevor, who had been watching their preparations with growing unease, finally found his voice. You're all crazy. The Ravens will tear this place apart. He began backing toward his bike, but Harrison's voice stopped him. You called them here, boy, the former ranger growled. You endangered these civilians. Now you've got a choice to make. Stand with us and try to fix your mistake, or run like a coward. The words hung in the desert air, heavy with judgment. The first scout bikes appeared at the edge of the property, their riders moving with military precision. They circled the perimeter once, assessing the situation, then pulled back to report. Alex knew they had minutes at most before the main force arrived. Harrison, your men still remember hand-to-hand combat? Alex asked, noting how the Iron Hounds had naturally fallen into defensive positions that suggested formal training. "We might need those skills again before this is over." "Rangers lead the way, Major," Harrison replied, a hint of his old pride showing through. "Just give the word." Behind him, Razor, Reaper, and Striker nodded grimly, their earlier drunken belligerence replaced by professional focus. The desert wind picked up, carrying the growing thunder of dozens of motorcycles. Alex did one final check of their preparations. Civilians secured, defensive positions established, communications in place. It wasn't a perfect setup, but she'd worked with less in combat zones across the world. "Whatever happens next," she addressed the defenders, "remember who you are. Not outlaws, not criminals, but soldiers. We protect the innocent, we stand our ground, we do what's right." Her words seemed to strike a chord, especially with the Iron Hounds members who had forgotten their military values. The sun dipped lower on the horizon as the first wave of night ravens appeared, their black bikes moving in perfect formation. At their head was a figure Alex recognized immediately from intelligence briefings, Richard Raven Blackwood, his military bearing evident even from a distance. The Desert Oasis was about to become a battlefield, but not the kind the Ravens were expecting. They were about to face something more powerful than mere violence. They were about to confront honor reborn. The Night Ravens approached in a perfect V formation, their synchronized riding speaking volumes about Blackwood's military discipline. 43 bikes, Alex counted quickly, their black chrome gleaming in the setting sun. The temperature had dropped slightly, but the tension in the air remained thick as desert smoke. Richard Raven Blackwood cut an imposing figure even from a distance, ramrod straight posture on his custom-built motorcycle, his leather vest adorned with military medals he had no right to wear anymore. Behind him, his men moved with the kind of precision that only came from extensive drilling and practice. "Look at that formation," Harrison muttered, professional admiration mixing with concern in his voice. "Classic cavalry approach. He's running this like a military operation." The former ranger's hands tightened on the makeshift barrier they'd constructed from empty oil drums and wooden pallets. "Because that's exactly what it is," Alex replied, her tactical mind analyzing every detail. "He's not here to intimidate, he's here to conquer territory. We're just the excuse." Through her borrowed binoculars, she could see that at least a third of the Ravens carried concealed weapons, their jackets bulging in telling ways. The Ravens executed a perfect synchronized stop, their engines cutting out in sequence to create an eerie silence. Blackwood dismounted first, his movements crisp and controlled. Even in biker leathers, he carried himself like the army officer he'd once been. 2 rows of Ravens created a corridor for him to walk through, a display of discipline that would have been impressive if it wasn't so menacing. "Well, well," Blackwood's voice carried across the parking lot, clear and commanding. "When I heard about trouble at the Desert Oasis, I expected something more substantial." His eyes swept over the defensive positions with military precision. "Instead, I find the Iron Hounds playing soldier with." He paused, his expression changing as he recognized Alex's stance. "Interesting. Very interesting." Diana Chen's voice crackled over the radio from her position in the command center. "Police scanner shows state troopers still 25 minutes out. Local sheriff finally responding, but they're even further." Her military training showed in her precise reporting. Samuel Richardson had positioned himself near the store's entrance, his medical kit ready but his Vietnam-era combat experience evident in how he kept to cover. "Got movement on the flanks," he reported quietly. "They're spreading out wider than they need to for just a show of force." Alex stepped forward, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening while maintaining tactical awareness. "Major Blackwood," she called out, using his former rank deliberately. "Quite a response for a simple highway stop dispute, unless this isn't about us at all." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Major Alexandra Winters, Special Forces, Distinguished Service Cross recipient. Now this is unexpected." He began pacing slowly, every step calculated. "You know, I make it a point to know every combat-decorated officer in a 100-mile radius. Call it professional courtesy." "More like tactical intelligence gathering," Alex countered, watching his men continue to spread out in textbook containment positions. Still running operations like it's Kandahar, aren't you? Except now, it's American civilians in the crossfire. Trevor, who had been frozen in place since the Ravens' arrival, suddenly broke into a run toward Blackwood. "Sir, I called you because these traitors need to be taught a lesson. The Iron Hounds have gone soft, and this army bit—" Blackwood's backhand caught Trevor across the face with military precision, dropping him to the asphalt. "I don't recall giving you permission to speak, boy." His voice remained eerily calm. "You're useful as an informant, nothing more. Adults are talking now." The casual violence sent a ripple through both groups. Alex noted how Harrison's men tensed, their old training responding to the threat even as their former drunken personalities would have cheered such action. The transformation in them was becoming more evident by the minute. "Last chance to walk away, Blackwood," Alex announced, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded Special Forces teams. "Whatever territorial expansion you're planning, it's not worth the attention this will bring. There are families here." Blackwood's laugh was genuine this time, but cold. "Walk away? Major Winters, you're outmanned, outgunned, and out of options. Though I admit," he glanced at the Iron Hounds' defensive positions, "your hasty preparations show promise." "Harrison," he called out, "your men have better discipline than I expected. Sure you won't reconsider your allegiances? The Ravens could use soldiers with actual combat experience." Harrison's response was immediate and clear. "Rather stand with one honorable soldier than 100 deserters, sir." Desert carried all the contempt he'd learned to mask during his military service. A flash of genuine anger crossed Blackwood's face. "Honor? You want to talk about honor?" His voice rose slightly. "I spent 20 years serving a system that threw us away once they were done with us. At least I'm honest about who and what I am now." He turned to his men. "Secure the perimeter. Anyone who resists—" The crack of a single gunshot cut through the evening air. All eyes turned to Samuel Richardson, who stood calmly holding an old service pistol pointed skyward. "Just wanted to remind everyone that some of us lived through worse hells than you can imagine, son," the Vietnam vet said steadily. "This isn't a war zone, and these aren't enemy combatants, they're American civilians. Remember your oath." The tension ratcheted up another notch as Blackwood's men instinctively reached for weapons. The next few moments would determine whether this confrontation ended in conversation or combat. Blackwood's hand moved almost imperceptibly, and his ravens froze in their tracks, weapons still concealed but ready. The disciplined response confirmed Alex's suspicions. These weren't just thugs playing soldier. They were trained military men who'd chosen the wrong path after service. The desert wind carried the scent of gun oil and leather, familiar smells from a life they'd all once led. "That oath became void when they discarded us like broken equipment," Blackwood said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. The setting sun cast long shadows behind him, making his formation of ravens appear even more menacing. "But you raise an interesting point about civilians, Mr. Richardson. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation." His words were diplomatic, but his posture remained combat-ready. Alex watched as Blackwood began pacing again, noting how his men adjusted their positions to maintain optimal coverage of their leader. Their movements were too precise, too practiced. The formation shifted like a living thing, each man knowing exactly where he needed to be. "They're not just here for territory," she said quietly to Harrison. "This is a rehearsed operation. We're looking at something bigger." Harrison nodded slightly, his ranger training helping him read the tactical situation. The way the Ravens maintained their spacing, their careful attention to lines of sight, it all spoke of serious planning. "Using us as a dress rehearsal, maybe. Testing response times, civilian reactions, police procedures." His face darkened with realization. "Got word from some contacts last week about a series of planned bank robberies across 3 states. Didn't think much of it at the time." "Major Winters," Blackwood called out, interrupting their whispered conversation. "A word in private? Professional courtesy between officers." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes remained cold and calculating, like a predator assessing its prey. The last rays of sunlight glinted off his military medals, symbols of honor now tarnished by his choices. "Counteroffer," Alex replied clearly. "You tell your men to back off to the highway and we can talk right here. Professional courtesy goes both ways." She maintained eye contact with Blackwood while tracking the movements of his men in her peripheral vision. Years of combat experience had taught her never to lose sight of the bigger picture, even when focusing on an immediate threat. Diana's voice crackled softly over the radio, her signal corps training evident in her precise reporting. Movement on the satellite feed. 3 more bikes approaching from the south. Looks like scout elements. In the background, Alex could hear the quiet whimpers of Diana's children, reminding her exactly what was at stake. Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive setup you've created in such short time. Communications, defensive positions, civilian evacuation protocols." He gestured at their preparations, his movements deliberately casual, but his gaze sharp and analytical. "Almost like you've done this before. Tell me, Major, how many times did you run similar operations overseas, protecting local populations from, what did they call us? Hostile elements?" "The difference is," Alex responded, her voice carrying the weight of conviction, "those were war zones. This is American soil. These are our people you're threatening." She took a deliberate step forward, hands open but ready. "And unlike you, most of us remember what that means." The words were chosen carefully, aimed at the soldier Blackwood had once been rather than the criminal he'd become. The comment struck home. Something flickered across Blackwood's face. A moment of doubt, perhaps, or buried memory. Behind him, several ravens shifted uncomfortably, their own military backgrounds causing them to wrestle with the implications of their actions. The facade of hardened criminals cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the servicemen they'd once been. "You think you understand what's happening here," Blackwood said, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. "You see a criminal gang threatening innocent civilians. But we're actually doing what the military trained us to do, taking and holding territory, establishing order, creating a new system when the old one fails." His words carried the bitter eloquence of a man who'd spent years justifying his fall from grace. Samuel Richardson's quiet laugh carried across the tense scene. "Son, I've heard that same justification in another language, in another war. Didn't believe it then, either." The Vietnam veteran's words seemed to resonate with some of the older ravens whose postures showed subtle signs of uncertainty. His combat-worn face carried the wisdom of someone who'd seen this story play out before. Suddenly, Trevor scrambled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip where Blackwood had struck him. "Enough talking," he screamed, pulling a concealed handgun from his jacket. "You're all weak, all of you." The weapon wavered between Alex and Harrison, his hands shaking with rage and fear. The last sunlight caught the barrel of his gun, throwing off dangerous glints. Time seemed to slow as multiple things happened at once. Blackwood's ravens reached for their weapons, their training overriding their leader's previous gestures for restraint. Harrison and his men moved to defensive positions with practiced speed, their own combat experience taking over. Samuel Richardson dropped behind cover, pulling Diana Chen down as she emerged to check the situation. The entire scene transformed into a tableau of potential violence. But Alex was already moving. Before Trevor could squeeze the trigger, she closed the distance between them with Special Forces speed. Her left hand diverted the weapon while her right delivered a precise strike to his wrist. The gun clattered to the pavement as Trevor found himself disarmed and pinned in one fluid motion. The technique was pure military efficiency. Minimum force, maximum effect. "Stand down!" Blackwood's voice cracked with authority, freezing his men in place. His eyes were fixed on Alex's technique, recognition flooding his features. "That's a Special Forces close combat maneuver taught only to certain units." He paused, understanding dawning. "You were there. Kandahar. Operation Breaking Chain." The name of the operation seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. Alex maintained her hold on Trevor, but met Blackwood's gaze. "Command Sergeant Wallace," she said quietly. "Remember him?" The officer who died, making sure everyone else got out alive. The one who believed in duty until his last breath. The mention of Wallace's name carried weight, touching something deep in their shared military past. The words hung in the desert air like smoke. Several of Blackwood's older ravens straightened involuntarily at the mention of Wallace's name, muscle memory from their military days taking over. Even Blackwood himself seemed to fight the urge to stand at attention. The man he'd once been struggled with the man he'd become. "He was a good man," Blackwood finally said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "One of the last ones." "He was," Alex agreed, her grip on Trevor never wavering. "And he'd be ashamed to see what his men have become." The tension in the air shifted palpably at the mention of Command Sergeant Wallace. Alex could see the impact rippling through the Ravens' formation as old memories surfaced. Several of the older members exchanged glances, their hardened exterior cracking to reveal glimpses of the soldiers they'd once been. The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the parking lot as the last rays of sunlight painted the scene in deep oranges and purples. Wallace believed in something bigger than himself, Alex continued, maintaining her hold on Trevor while keeping her attention on Blackwood. He believed in duty, honor, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He died living those values. Her words carried across the parking lot, touching something deep in the military men present, both friend and foe. Blackwood's face contorted with a complex mix of emotions: anger, shame, and something deeper, more painful. "You don't get to use his name," he growled, but his voice lacked conviction. "You don't understand what happened after Kandahar, how they treated us when we came home, the promises they broke." "Actually, I do," Alex replied calmly. Behind her, Harrison and his men had maintained their defensive positions, but their attention was fixed on the unfolding conversation. "I was there when they shut down the Veterans Support Program, when they cut funding for PTSD treatment, when they turned their backs on soldiers who'd given everything." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But Wallace taught us something else too, that our duty isn't to the system, it's to each other, and to the people we swore to protect." Diana's voice came softly over the radio. "Police scanner update. State troopers 15 minutes out. Multiple units responding." The information added urgency to the moment, but Alex kept her focus on Blackwood, recognizing the critical juncture they'd reached. "Look around you, Richard," she said, using his first name deliberately. "Look at what you're doing. Armed men threatening civilians at a highway stop? Planning robberies that'll put innocent lives at risk? Is this really the legacy you want to leave? Is this what Wallace died for?" Several of the Ravens shifted uncomfortably, their formation losing some of its military precision. One of the older members, a grizzled man with a Desert Storm tattoo visible on his neck, spoke up. "Major Blackwood, sir. She's not wrong, this isn't what we signed up for." Trevor struggled in Alex's hold, his voice pitched high with desperation. "Don't listen to them. They're trying to manipulate you. We're stronger than this." But his words rang hollow in the growing dusk, the desperate cries of someone watching their world crumble. Samuel Richardson stepped forward, his Vietnam-era combat experience evident in how he kept aware of cover, even as he moved. "Son," he addressed Blackwood directly, "I've seen what happens when soldiers lose their way. Saw it in '69, saw it again in Desert Storm, seeing it now. But I've also seen men find their way back. It's never too late to remember who you really are." Harrison joined in, his voice carrying the weight of his own redemption. "An hour ago, I was drunk and looking for trouble, ready to hurt innocent people just to feel powerful." He gestured to his Iron Hounds. Major Winters reminded us of something we'd forgotten, that being a soldier isn't about the uniform, it's about what's in your heart, about choosing to do what's right, even when it's hard. Blackwood's composure cracked further, his hand moved to one of his medals, Alex recognized it as a bronze star, and his fingers traced its edges. "You make it sound so simple," he said, but the bitter edge in his voice had softened. "Just choose to do the right thing? After everything we've been through? Everything we've become?" "Nothing simple about it," Alex responded, finally releasing Trevor but maintaining a ready stance. "It's the hardest choice you'll ever make, but look at your men, Richard. Really look at them. They're not criminals at heart. They're lost soldiers looking for leadership. Real leadership." The Ravens' formation had completely dissolved now, individual men standing straighter, years of ingrained military bearing reasserting itself. The desert night was closing in, but the parking lot lights had come on, casting everything in harsh fluorescent clarity. Diana's voice came over the radio again. "Major, multiple headlights approaching from the north. Looks like state troopers, about 10 minutes out." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens could be heard, growing closer with each passing second. Blackwood looked at his men, then back at Alex, the internal struggle visible on his face. "Wallace's last words," he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Do you remember them?" Alex nodded solemnly. "Take care of our people. He said it right before he ordered us to fall back, before he held that position alone so we could get the civilians out." "Take care of our people," Blackwood repeated softly. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. He turned to his Ravens, drawing himself up to his full height. For a moment, everyone present saw not the outlaw biker leader, but the army major he'd once been. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of command. "All units, stand down." The transformation in the Ravens was immediate and profound. Weapons were secured, postures relaxed, and in many faces there was visible relief. The soldiers they'd once been began to emerge from behind the criminal facades they'd adopted. The Desert Oasis parking lot fell into an eerie calm as the Ravens stood down. Trevor, still nursing his injured wrist, stared in disbelief as the feared outlaw motorcycle gang transformed before his eyes into something resembling a military formation. The approaching sirens grew louder, their wail echoing off the desert mountains in the distance. "You know what happens next," Alex said to Blackwood, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Those state troopers are coming in hot, expecting a gang war. How we handle the next few minutes determines whether this ends in handcuffs or conversation." She assessed the situation rapidly. 40-plus bikers, most with concealed weapons, and law enforcement expecting the worst. Blackwood nodded, years of military training taking over. "Ravens, prepare to receive law enforcement. Weapons secured, hands visible, full compliance." His voice carried the same command authority it had in Afghanistan, and his men responded instantly, muscle memory overriding their years as outlaws. Harrison turned to his Iron Hounds, his own leadership reasserting itself. "Same goes for us. We show them we're standing down voluntarily." He paused, then added with a hint of his old Ranger pride, "Let's show them the difference between soldiers and thugs." Samuel Richardson emerged from his cover position, medical kit in hand. "Got some minor injuries we should tend to before the troopers arrive. Makes a better impression." He moved among both groups, treating scraped knuckles and minor cuts with the efficient care of a combat medic. Each small interaction seemed to further dissolve the barriers between the former adversaries. Diana's voice crackled over the radio one final time. 5 minutes to police contact. Highway patrol, state troopers, and county sheriff all incoming. They're expecting armed resistance. She paused, then added, "I've got experience with police liaison from my Signal Corps days. Want me to handle initial communication?" "Good thinking," Alex replied. "Mr. Morgan, keep those civilians secure in the back room for now. Mr. Richardson, you might want to stay visible. Having a Vietnam vet vouching for the situation could help de-escalate things." Blackwood watched these preparations with a mixture of professional appreciation and personal regret. "We had it all planned out, you know," he said quietly to Alex. "This was supposed to be a test run, checking response times, civilian reactions, police coordination. 3 banks across 2 states next week. Everything timed to military precision. Using your training to become what we fought against, Alex observed, but her tone remained neutral, free of judgment. How many of your men were really committed to that path, Richard? How many were just following orders because that's what soldiers do? The Ravens' leader looked at his men, really looked at them for the first time in years. He saw the relief in their postures as they stood at parade rest, the natural way they fell back into military bearing. Most of them are combat vets, he admitted. Iraq, Afghanistan, some even from Desert Storm. Lost their way when they came home, just like I did. The Ravens gave them structure, purpose. But the wrong purpose, Harrison interjected, joining them. Been there myself. Easier to be angry, to blame the world. Easier to be feared than to face what we've become. Around them, Iron Hounds and Ravens had begun mingling, sharing quiet words, recognizing each other as fellow veterans rather than rivals. The first police lights became visible on the horizon, red and blue flashing against the darkening desert sky. Trevor, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "You're all insane. They'll arrest everyone here. We should run while we still can." "Running's what got us here in the first place," Blackwood replied, his voice heavy with realization. "Running from our trauma, our responsibilities, who we really are." He straightened his leather vest, adjusting the military medals that suddenly felt heavier than ever. Time to stop running. Alex surveyed the scene one final time, former enemies standing together, weapons secured, injuries treated, civilians protected. It wasn't the outcome anyone had expected when the Iron Hounds had rolled into the Desert Oasis hours earlier, but sometimes the most important victories came from battles that were never fought. "What happens now?" one of the younger Ravens asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a soldier awaiting orders. "Now," Alex replied, "we do what soldiers do. We face the consequences of our actions. We protect civilians. We help our fellow veterans find their way back." She turned to Blackwood. "And we honor Command Sergeant Wallace's last order. We take care of our people." The first police vehicles were now visible, a long line of headlights snaking through the desert darkness. Samuel Richardson stood ready with his medical kit and military ID. Diana Chen prepared to coordinate communications from the store's office. The Iron Hounds and Ravens, no longer enemies, stood in neat formations that would have made their drill sergeants proud. "Major Winters," Blackwood said formally, drawing himself up to attention, "thank you for reminding us of who we are." Around him, his Ravens straightened instinctively, responding to their leader's bearing. The change in them was remarkable, from hardened criminals to lost soldiers finding their way home. The police vehicles began pulling into the parking lot, lights flashing and sirens wailing. But they weren't arriving to find a gang war. Instead, they found something far more powerful. Veterans helping veterans, soldiers remembering their oath, and men choosing to become the heroes they'd once been. The first state trooper vehicle slid to a stop, kicking up desert dust in the harsh glare of emergency lights. Officer Michael Hayes emerged, weapon drawn but low, his tactical training evident in how he assessed the scene. His eyes widened slightly at the sight before him. Dozens of bikers standing in formation, their poses military rather than menacing. "Officer Hayes," Alex called out, her hands clearly visible. "Major Alexandra Winters, U.S. Army Special Forces retired. The situation is under control." She approached slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Behind her, both the Ravens and Iron Hounds maintained their disciplined stance. Diana Chen's voice came clearly over the radio to all units. "All civilians secure in the fallout shelter. No injuries, no hostages, no active threats." Her Signal Corps training proved invaluable as she professionally coordinated with incoming law enforcement. More police vehicles arrived, surrounding the desert oasis in a ring of flashing lights. Samuel Richardson stepped forward, his Vietnam service cap visible in the strobing red and blue. "Combat medic, 173rd Airborne Brigade," he announced clearly. "I've treated all minor injuries. Everyone here is complying voluntarily." Officer Hayes kept his weapon ready but showed he was listening. Dispatch said possible gang war, 40-plus armed suspects, civilians in danger. His eyes scanned the unusually orderly scene. "This doesn't look like any gang situation I've ever seen." "Because it's not anymore," Blackwood said, stepping forward with military precision. "Major Richard Blackwood, formerly U.S. Army. My men and I are surrendering ourselves into custody." He paused, then added with renewed purpose, "And we have information about planned criminal activities that we'd like to share with proper authorities." Trevor, still skulking at the edge of the group, made a sudden break for his motorcycle. He didn't make it 3 steps before 4 veterans, 2 Ravens and 2 Iron Hounds moving in perfect coordination, had him pinned. The takedown was professional, controlled, showing none of the gang violence the police had expected to find. More officers approached cautiously, weapons still drawn but their stance less aggressive as they recognized the military bearing of the men before them. Harrison addressed his Iron Hounds. "Full cooperation, complete disclosure. Time to make things right." His men nodded, their earlier drunken belligerence replaced by soldiers' discipline. Alex watched as the scene transformed into something remarkable. Veterans from different eras, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, began sharing their stories with the officers. Tales of lost purpose, of searching for brotherhood in the wrong places, of finding their way back through an unexpected confrontation at a desert highway stop. "Major Winters," Officer Hayes said, holstering his weapon as he recognized the situation was truly under control. "Want to tell me how you turned a potential bloodbath into what looks like a military formation?" Alex smiled slightly. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded of who they really are." She gestured to the gathered veterans. "Every man here served his country with honor once. They just lost their way for a while. Tonight they found it again." Samuel Richardson moved among the group, still tending to minor injuries while sharing quiet words of understanding with younger veterans. His presence seemed to bridge the generations, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, a living reminder of the timeless bonds between soldiers. Jack Morgan emerged from the store, leading the civilians from the secure room. Diana Chen's children stared in wonder at the transformed bikers who now stood like the soldiers in their history books. The elderly couple from the RV approached Samuel Richardson, the husband exchanging knowing looks with his fellow Vietnam veteran. "Got something to show you," Blackwood said to Officer Hayes, reaching slowly into his vest. He withdrew a folded paper, detailed plans for the bank robberies they'd been preparing. Full operational plans, including names, locations, and dates. "We'll give you everything you need to stop it all." Harrison added his own intelligence about other criminal activities in the area, his Rangers training evident in the precision of his reporting. The Iron Hounds and Ravens worked together, providing law enforcement with a comprehensive picture of the criminal enterprises they were walking away from. As the night deepened, more remarkable transformations unfolded. Veterans who had been enemies hours before now stood together, sharing stories of their service, their struggles, and their hope for redemption. The police officers, many veterans themselves, began to understand that they were witnessing something more than just the prevention of a gang war. "Major," one of the younger Ravens approached Alex, standing at parade rest out of habit. "Some of us were talking. After we handle the legal consequences of our actions, maybe we could use our skills for something better. Help other vets who are lost like we were." Alex nodded, seeing the same thought spreading through both groups. The night's events had awakened something powerful. Not just the memory of their military service, but the possibility of a new mission, a chance to make things right. Officer Hayes was coordinating with his superiors, explaining the unique situation. "Sir, these men are cooperating fully. Many are decorated veterans. They're providing crucial intelligence about major criminal operations." He paused, looking at the gathered men. This could be an opportunity for rehabilitation rather than just prosecution. The desert night had grown cool, but nobody moved to leave. The parking lot of the Desert Oasis had become something sacred, a place of transformation, of soldiers finding their way home. Trevor, now in handcuffs, watched in bitter disbelief as his attempt to incite violence had instead sparked a revolution of honor. Diana Chen approached Alex, her children close behind. "You did more than stop a gang war tonight, Major. You helped lost soldiers find their way back to the men they used to be, the men they were meant to be." The next few hours at the Desert Oasis transformed the highway stop into an impromptu veterans gathering. Law enforcement had secured the scene, but the atmosphere was far from tense. Officers, many of them veterans themselves, found themselves engaged in deep conversations with both the Ravens and Iron Hounds about service, struggle, and the difficult path home. "Got something interesting here," Officer Hayes announced, returning from a conference call with his superiors. "DA's office is willing to work with you given the circumstances. They're especially interested in the intelligence about larger criminal operations." He looked directly at Blackwood. "Your cooperation could help shut down some serious criminal enterprises across 3 states. Blackwood stood straight, his military bearing now fully restored. "Full cooperation, complete disclosure, and I'll take full responsibility for my men's actions. Many of them just needed leadership. They followed orders, even when those orders led them down the wrong path." "That's not your call anymore, sir," one of the older Ravens spoke up, stepping forward. "We each make our own choice now. Like the Major said, time to be soldiers again, face our actions head on." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group as more Ravens stepped forward, ready to account for their past choices. Harrison gathered his Iron Hounds, their earlier drunken haze long gone. "We've got our own amends to make. Been terrorizing this area too long, forgetting everything we once stood for." He turned to Alex. "Major, if you're willing, we could use some guidance. Help us remember how to serve instead of intimidate." Samuel Richardson, who had been quietly observing while tending to minor injuries, spoke up. "Back in '69, we had a saying, 'Lost soldiers find their way home through the light of brotherhood.'" He looked around at the gathered veterans. "Maybe that's what this place becomes, a waypoint for lost soldiers." The idea seemed to take hold immediately. Jack Morgan, the highway stop owner, stepped forward. "Desert Oasis was always meant to be a rest stop. Maybe it becomes something more, a place where veterans can find their way back, like you all did tonight." Diana Chen, still coordinating communications from her makeshift command center, added her own thoughts. "We could set up a proper veterans outreach center. I still have contacts in the VA, connections with support services. Turn this from a place of confrontation to one of healing." Alex watched as the transformation continued to unfold. The Ravens and Iron Hounds, no longer divided by artificial rivalries, were already beginning to work together. Some were helping officers document criminal activities they could help prevent. Others were sharing stories with younger officers, turning their experiences into cautionary tales and lessons learned. Trevor, still in custody, watched with increasing confusion as his attempt to incite violence instead sparked something remarkable. "You're all crazy," he muttered, but his words carried no weight in the face of the changes taking place. "You know what Command Sergeant Wallace would say about all this?" Blackwood mused, standing beside Alex as they watched the scene unfold. "He'd say, 'Mission accomplished. Just not the mission we thought we were on.'" He touched the military medals on his vest, no longer wearing them as trophies but as reminders of the oath he'd once taken. Harrison approached them, his face showing the weight of decisions being made. "Most of my men are willing to face charges, make things right. But they're asking if afterward, if they could be part of whatever this becomes." He gestured to the Desert Oasis. "Turn our skills toward helping other vets instead of causing trouble." Officer Hayes, overhearing this, added his own perspective. "DA's office is interested in rehabilitation over punishment, especially for veterans. Your cooperation tonight, plus a commitment to change, it could make a real difference in how this plays out. As the night deepened, more ideas began to take shape. The Ravens and Iron Hounds, drawing on their military experience, started sketching out plans for converting their former clubhouses into veteran support centers. Their knowledge of local troubled veterans could help identify those most in need of intervention. Samuel Richardson, displaying the quiet wisdom of his Vietnam-era service, moved among the groups, offering perspective and understanding. Every generation of soldiers faces this challenge, he explained to a cluster of younger veterans. Finding purpose after service, dealing with the memories, rebuilding life as a civilian. But no one has to face it alone. Diana Chen emerged from the store office, her children now sleeping safely inside. Just got word from my VA contacts. They're interested in what happened here tonight. Think it could be a model for veteran intervention programs. Soldiers helping soldiers find their way back. Alex observed all of this with quiet satisfaction. What had started as a potential tragedy had transformed into something powerful, a moment of redemption of soldiers remembering their true purpose. The desert oasis under the vast Arizona sky had become a crucible of change. Major Winters, Officer Hayes said, approaching with fresh coffee for everyone. I've never seen anything quite like this in 15 years of law enforcement. You didn't just prevent a gang war, you might have started a revolution in veteran rehabilitation. The first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky, promising a new day in more ways than one. The desert oasis stood ready to begin its own transformation, from a simple highway stop to a beacon of hope for lost soldiers seeking their way home. As dawn painted the desert sky in shades of purple and gold, the desert oasis buzzed with purposeful activity. Law enforcement had established a command center in the parking lot, processing statements and coordinating with other agencies. But more importantly, something extraordinary was taking shape among the gathered veterans. Got off the phone with the VA Regional Director? Diana Chen announced, emerging from her makeshift command post. They're sending representatives today. What happened here, they think it could be the beginning of something significant. Her military efficiency was evident as she organized papers and contact information. They're particularly interested in how quickly veterans responded to proper leadership and purpose. Blackwood, who had spent the last few hours providing detailed intelligence about criminal operations to state authorities, turned to address his ravens. Each of you has a choice to make now, he said, his voice carrying the authority of command but tempered with new understanding. We face consequences for our actions, that's non-negotiable. But we also have an opportunity to turn our skills towards something worthwhile. Harrison and his Iron Hounds had sobered completely, the night's events burning away more than just alcohol. Been thinking about our compound, he said, joining the discussion. Got a good setup there. Garage, meeting rooms, plenty of space. Instead of using it for trouble, could be a place for vets to come, work on bikes, find their footing. Samuel Richardson, who hadn't left despite the long night, nodded approvingly. In Vietnam, we learned that healing often happens shoulder to shoulder, working on something together. Motorcycle maintenance, building things, it gives the mind focus while the heart does its healing. Officer Hayes returned from another conference call, his expression thoughtful. Just got word from the FBI. Your intel about those bank operations. It's already preventing similar activities in 2 other states. They're talking about reduced sentences in exchange for continued cooperation and veteran rehabilitation programs. The Ravens and Iron Hounds, once rivals and now united in purpose, had begun sharing ideas about how to identify and reach troubled veterans in their area. Their knowledge of the biker community, combined with their military experience, could help spot those at risk of following the same dark path they had. The thing about soldiers, Alex observed, watching the transformation continue to unfold, is that we never really forget our training. The discipline, the sense of purpose, the desire to serve, it's all still there, just waiting to be reawakened. She turned to Blackwood and Harrison. You both proved that tonight. Diana's children had awakened and were watching the scene with fascination. The younger one tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, are they really all soldiers? The question carried the innocent wonder of youth, seeing beyond the leather and tattoos to the heroes these men had once been. And could be again. That's the thing about being a soldier, Diana explained to her son, loud enough for others to hear. It's not just about wearing a uniform. It's about what's in your heart, the commitment to protect, to serve, to stand for something bigger than yourself. Jack Morgan, who had been quietly supporting everyone with coffee and supplies throughout the night, stepped forward with a proposal. Been running this stop for 30 years, he said. Never felt it had much purpose beyond giving travelers a place to rest. But now, he gestured to the gathered veterans. Maybe it becomes something more. A waypoint for soldiers finding their way home. The idea resonated strongly. Several Ravens and Iron Hounds immediately began offering suggestions for converting parts of the Desert Oasis into a proper veterans center. Their military training surfaced in how they approached the planning. Methodical, thorough, considering all angles. Could set up a proper mechanical training program, one former Raven suggested. A lot of us found peace working on bikes. Could teach those skills to other vets, give them a trade. Need counseling services too, Harrison added. Real ones, not just bar talk and bad decisions. Some of us. He paused, showing rare vulnerability. Some of us never really dealt with what we brought back from war. Samuel Richardson placed a steadying hand on Harrison's shoulder. First step's always the hardest, son. Admitting you need help, that takes more courage than any battlefield. Trevor, still under guard but watching everything unfold, finally spoke up. You're all delusional, he spat. Think you can just erase everything you've done? Turn a bunch of criminals into saints? No, Blackwood replied calmly. We can't erase the past. But we can choose a different future. That's something else the military taught us. Adapt, overcome, drive on. His words carried the weight of a hard-won wisdom. As the morning sun climbed higher, more changes were taking shape. Veterans from both groups were exchanging contact information with law enforcement and VA representatives, building bridges instead of walls. Plans were being drawn up for converting their old gathering places into support centers. The transformation that had begun with a confrontation was evolving into something powerful and lasting. Alex watched it all with quiet satisfaction, remembering Command Sergeant Wallace's last words. Take care of our people. Tonight, in an unexpected way, his final order was being honored. The Desert Oasis was becoming exactly what its name suggested, a place of refuge, of renewal, of hope in the desert of civilian life that so many veterans struggled to navigate. You know, Officer Hayes said thoughtfully, when I got the call about gang trouble at a highway stop, I never expected to witness something like this. Never thought I'd see hardened outlaws transform back into the soldiers they once were. Sometimes, Alex replied, all it takes is reminding warriors of their true purpose. The rest, she gestured to the scene of former enemies working together, planning together, healing together, follows naturally. 3 months after the confrontation at the Desert Oasis, Alex Winters stood in the parking lot, amazed by the transformation before her. The once simple highway stop had evolved into something remarkable, a beacon of hope for veterans seeking their way home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the newly expanded parking area, now filled with motorcycles belonging to veterans from all branches of service. Major Winters! Diana Chen called out, emerging from what had once been a simple store office and was now a fully staffed Veterans Services Center. The VA just approved our additional funding request. We can expand the counseling program. Her Signal Corps' efficiency had proven invaluable in navigating bureaucracy and coordinating services. Behind her, her children played safely in an area where once bikers had postured and threatened. The garage, once a scene of confrontation, now housed a state-certified vocational training center. Through the open doors, Alex could see Harrison teaching motorcycle maintenance to a group of recently returned veterans. His voice, once slurred with alcohol and anger, now carried the steady authority of a skilled instructor sharing his expertise. 27 job placements this month alone, Samuel Richardson reported, approaching with his ever-present medical kit. The Vietnam veteran had become a cornerstone of the operation, his own experiences bridging generations of service. And the peer counseling programs making a real difference. Something about warriors helping warriors seems to work better than traditional approaches. The legal consequences of that night had played out exactly as Officer Hayes had suggested. Both the Ravens and Iron Hounds had faced justice, but their cooperation and commitment to change had led to opportunities for rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Many were now involved in helping law enforcement prevent other veterans from falling into the same patterns they had. Blackwood, now serving a reduced sentence, had transformed his Ravens' former holdings into additional veteran support centers. His military leadership skills, once used to command a criminal enterprise, were now directed toward helping fellow veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. Even from behind bars, he coordinated programs and offered guidance. "Got 3 more chapters reaching out," Harrison said, wiping grease from his hands as he joined them. "Other motorcycle clubs seeing what we've done here, wanting to make similar changes." The Iron Hounds had completely transformed, their leather vests now bearing patches that spoke of service and support rather than intimidation. Jack Morgan emerged from the expanded store, which now included a proper dining area where veterans could gather, share stories, and find the brotherhood they missed from their service days. "Should have seen it this morning," he said proudly. "Had a young Marine, just back from overseas, looking lost as can be. Within an hour, he was talking with 3 Vietnam vets, getting more straight advice than any official program could offer." Trevor had taken a different path, choosing to serve his time without engaging in the rehabilitation programs, but his actions had inadvertently sparked something powerful, a movement of veterans helping veterans find their way back from the brink. "Remember that night?" Diana asked, watching her children play safely where once violence had threatened. "When you turned potential tragedy into something remarkable," she gestured to the transformed Desert Oasis. "Nobody could have predicted this outcome." Alex smiled, remembering the tense confrontation that had started it all. "Sometimes the best victories come from battles that were never fought," she said. "These men didn't need another enemy to fight. They needed to remember who they really were." The sound of motorcycles approaching drew their attention. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, their formation speaking of military background. But unlike that night 3 months ago, these bikes brought hope rather than threat. More veterans seeking the help and brotherhood they'd heard about at the Desert Oasis. "You know what Command Sergeant Wallace would say about all this?" Samuel Richardson mused, watching the newcomers approach. "He'd say this is the real mission. Soldiers taking care of soldiers, no matter how far they've strayed." The Desert Oasis had become more than just a waypoint on a desert highway. It was a testament to the enduring spirit of military service, a proof that even the most hardened hearts could find their way back to honor. The confrontation that had begun with drunken harassment had evolved into something powerful, a model for veteran rehabilitation that was spreading across the country. As the morning sun climbed higher over the desert landscape, Alex watched another day of transformation begin at the Desert Oasis. Veterans helping veterans, soldiers remembering their true purpose, warriors finding their way home. The night that could have ended in violence had instead sparked a revolution of hope. "Major Winters," a young veteran approached, standing unconsciously at parade rest. "Thank you. Not just for stopping a gang war that night, but for helping us remember who we are, who we can be again." Alex nodded, understanding that some victories aren't won with weapons or violence, but with the courage to choose a better path. The Desert Oasis stood as proof that even in the darkest moments, honor could be reborn, purpose could be rediscovered, and lost soldiers could find their way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.